Let's get started. Story number 1.
The old farmhouse had been empty for years. The locals called it the Walters house, after the family who had owned it for generations, though no one in town could quite agree on what had happened to them. Some said they had moved away suddenly, while others whispered of tragedy and loss that drove them to abandon the home. Either way, it sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by fields that had gone wild with neglect, its paint peeling and windows dark. It was the perfect project for Jessica. A freelance writer with a penchant for all things historical, Jessica had bought the property at auction for next to nothing. She planned to renovate it, document the process, and perhaps write a book about the house's history. It was a dream project, one that combined her love of storytelling with her knack for research. When she first arrived, she found the house in worse shape than she'd imagined. The roof sagged in places, the wooden floorboards creaked ominously, and the air inside was thick with the smell of mildew. Still, she was undeterred. She set up her small camping cot in what had once been the living room, surrounded by boxes of tools and cleaning supplies. The first night, she fell asleep to the sound of crickets chirping outside and the distant hoot of an owl. But by the second night, the peacefulness began to feel oppressive. The silence inside the house was different. Heavier. Jessica dismissed it as her imagination and kept working, spending her days scrubbing grime from the walls and tearing up rotted floorboards. It wasn't until she started finding the photographs that things took a darker turn. The first one was tucked behind a broken dresser in the upstairs bedroom. It was an old black and white portrait of a woman and a little boy, both dressed in Sunday best. The woman had a faint, serene smile, but the boy looked away from the camera, his expression unreadable. On the back of the photo, someone had written in faded ink, "Margaret and Henry, 1932. Jessica found more photos as she worked, stuffed into cracks in the walls, hidden under loose floorboards, and once, bizarrely, sealed in an empty jar in the pantry. The faces in the photographs became familiar. Margaret, Henry, and an older man she assumed was the patriarch of the Walters family. But the more photos she found, the stranger they became. In one, Henry stood in the field behind the house, staring straight into the camera with wide, fearful eyes. In another, Margaret's serene smile was gone, replaced by a look of anguish. Jessica began to feel uneasy, but convinced herself they were just artifacts of a family's history, nothing more. By the end of the first week, Jessica started hearing the noises. At first, it was faint, a soft knocking sound that came from upstairs at odd hours. She assumed it was an animal or the old house settling, but then it grew louder. One night as she lay on her cot trying to fall asleep, she heard it distinctly. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor above her. She grabbed her flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase, her heart pounding. The upstairs was empty, just as she'd expected, but the air felt colder than it should have been, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She went back downstairs, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that she wasn't alone. The next day, Jessica decided to do some research. She visited the local library and dug through old records, searching for anything about the Walters family. What she found was unsettling. Margaret Walters had died in 1933, the victim of what the papers described as a tragic accident. Her husband, Samuel, had been found wandering the fields days later, and just incoherent and muttering about voices and shadows. He was committed to a sanitarium shortly afterward. Henry, their young son, had vanished without a trace. Jessica returned to the house with a mix of dread and determination. She couldn't explain why, but she felt compelled to stay, as if leaving would mean abandoning the story, or perhaps the people she had uncovered. That night, the knocking started again, followed by the sound of faint whispers. She tried to sleep, but her rest was broken by vivid dreams of Margaret standing at the foot of her cot, her lips moving soundlessly as tears streamed down her face. In the dream, Margaret pointed to the attic door, her eyes wide with desperation. When Jessica woke, she found herself clutching the flashlight. The attic door loomed in the corner of the room, the paint around the frame chipped and discolored. She had avoided it so far, partly because the ladder was rickety and partly because she dreaded what she might find up there. But now she felt like she had no choice. The attic was cramped and musty, filled with broken furniture and old trunks. She moved carefully, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. In the far corner, she found a small wooden box. Inside were letters, brittle with age, written in Margaret's delicate handwriting. The letters painted a grim picture. Margaret wrote about Samuel's growing paranoia, how he believed the house was haunted by something dark and malevolent. She described hearing whispers in the night and finding doors she knew she'd locked standing wide open. In her final letter, dated just days before her death, Margaret wrote, "If anything happens to me, look in the cellar." Jessica's hands trembled as she set the letter down. She had been avoiding the cellar since she arrived, put off by the narrow, crumbling staircase and the overwhelming smell of damp earth that wafted up whenever she passed the door. But now, she knew she had to go down there. The cellar was worse than she'd imagined. The air was heavy, the walls slick with moisture, and the single light bulb overhead cast long, flickering shadows. She found nothing at first, just old jars of preserves and rusted tools. But as she moved toward the back wall, her foot hit something solid. It was a small, makeshift grave, marked by a crumbling wooden cross. Jessica stared at it, her stomach turning. She dropped to her knees and began to dig with her hands, dirt caking under her fingernails. Just a few inches down, she uncovered tiny bones, brittle and yellowed with age. Henry. A wave of nausea hit her, but before she could react further, the light bulb flickered and went out. She was plunged into darkness, and then she heard it, a soft, childlike giggle, followed by the sound of footsteps running toward her. Jessica screamed, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall. She fumbled for her flashlight, but when she turned it on, the cellar was empty. The footsteps had stopped, but the oppressive feeling remained, pressing down on her chest like a weight. She fled the cellar, locking the door behind her and collapsing on the floor of the kitchen. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. She knew that now. Whatever had happened there, whatever lingered, it wasn't something she could handle alone. The next morning, Jessica packed her things and left, vowing never to return. She sold the property to a developer who tore the house down within months. The land is empty now, just an overgrown lot at the end of a forgotten road. But sometimes, late at night, passing motorists swear they hear a child's laughter drifting through the air, faint and fleeting like a memory that refuses to die.
Story number 2.
I had never believed in ghosts. To me, they were nothing more than stories, shadows created by overactive imaginations or tricks of light playing on our fears. That changed one summer when I moved into a small, aging apartment in the heart of a city with a long history. The building was old, at least a century, with creaky wooden floors and tall windows that let in little light. But it had charm, ornate crown molding, a fireplace that hadn't worked in decades, and an affordable price tag. I had just started a new job and was eager to embrace my independence, even if it meant living in a space that felt a little off. It started innocently enough. I noticed things in the apartment that didn't make sense. Small items like my keys or a coffee mug would be in places I didn't remember leaving them. I figured I was just absent-minded, too preoccupied with adjusting to a new routine. But as the days passed, the incidents became harder to ignore. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find every cabinet door in the kitchen wide open. At first, I thought someone had broken in, but nothing was missing, and the lock on the door was still bolted from the inside. I shut the cabinets, chalking it up to my own carelessness, even though I knew I hadn't left them that way. A week later, I was woken up in the middle of the night by the sound of footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, slow and deliberate, crossing the living room toward my bedroom. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, ready to call the police, but when I turned on the light and opened the door, the apartment was empty. The silence that followed was suffocating. The next morning, I told myself it had been a dream. I was tired, stressed, and maybe a little lonely. Those were the real explanations, I convinced myself. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It lingered in the corners of the apartment, in the cold spots that seemed to follow me no matter where I went. One night, I invited my best friend Claire over. I needed someone to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. We spent the evening drinking wine and laughing, the way we always did, and for a few hours, the apartment felt normal again. But as the night wore on, Claire grew quiet. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" I replied, though I already knew what she meant. "It's like we're not alone." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, to change the subject, but she wouldn't let it go. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes darting to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. By the time she left, I was on edge. The apartment felt heavier somehow, like the air was thicker. I stayed up late, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, unwilling to turn off the lights. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell into a restless sleep. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up. The room was dark, but I could feel it. Something was there. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand. My hand froze when I heard it. A faint whisper coming from the corner of the room. "Help me." My breath caught in my throat. The voice was soft, almost childlike, but filled with a sorrow that made my chest ache. I turned on the light, but the corner was empty. I sat there, paralyzed, until the sun rose. The next day I couldn't focus at work. The whisper replayed in my head over and over. "Help me." I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, but deep down I knew it wasn't. That night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, I scoured the apartment looking for anything that might explain what was happening. When I reached the living room, I noticed a draft near the fireplace, even though the windows were closed. I crouched down and shone the flashlight into the dark opening. That's when I saw it, a small wooden box wedged into a crevice just inside the fireplace. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. The box was old, its surface worn smooth with age, and it was sealed with a rusted latch. I pried it open, revealing a collection of yellowed papers and a photograph. The photograph was of a young girl, no older than 10, with long braids and a solemn expression. Written on the back in faded ink was a name, Lillian. The papers were letters, written in a neat, looping script. As I read them, a terrible story unfolded. Lillian had lived in the apartment with her family in the early 1900s. Her letters spoke of fear, of a dark presence she felt watching her at night, a stare, of whispers that kept her awake, of a growing terror that no one else seemed to believe. The last letter ended abruptly with a single line scrawled in shaky handwriting, "He's coming for me." I sat back, the box slipping from my hands. The pieces clicked together in my mind, and I felt sick. Lillian hadn't just disappeared. She had died here, in this apartment, and whatever had tormented her hadn't left. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, echoing through the apartment, filling every corner. "Help me," they pleaded over and over. I wanted to run, to leave and never come back, but I couldn't move. I could feel her standing just behind me, her presence cold and desperate. "I'll help you," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Tell me what to do." The whispers stopped. The room grew still, the air heavy with anticipation. Then, slowly, the fireplace began to creak. The grate fell forward, revealing a small, hidden compartment in the back. Inside was a lockbox, rusted shut. I pried it open with trembling hands, revealing a collection of trinkets, Lillian's diary, a locket, and a crumpled piece of paper. The paper was a confession, written in the same looping script as the letters. It spoke of a man, a trusted family friend, who had betrayed and harmed Lillian in the most unspeakable ways. The truth had been buried, along with her. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I took the confession and the photograph to the local historical society. They helped me piece together the rest of the story and ensured Lillian's name and her suffering would not be forgotten. That night, the apartment was quiet. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. I moved out shortly afterward, unable to stay in a place that held so much pain. But I kept Lillian's photograph tucked into the pages of her diary. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine I can hear her voice, not pleading, but thanking me, her whispers finally at rest. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I never thought I'd live in a house like the one on Willow Lane. It wasn't grand or glamorous, but it had character. A Victorian-style home with a wraparound porch and a towering oak tree in the front yard. When my husband, Mark, and I bought it, we thought it was the perfect place to start our lives together. It needed some work, sure, but that was part of the charm. Or so we thought. The first time I felt it, we had just moved in. It was late and the house was quiet. I was unpacking boxes in the kitchen when I felt a strange chill pass over me, like someone had walked by. I froze, listening, but there was no sound. I laughed it off, new house jitters, I told myself. Mark didn't feel it, or if he did, he didn't say anything. He was too busy tackling the endless list of repairs the house demanded. But as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a persistent unease, like the house was watching me. It started small. Objects wouldn't be where I left them. A book I'd been reading would appear on the coffee table when I was sure I'd left it on the nightstand. The back door, which I always locked before bed, would sometimes be standing open in the morning. Mark said it was an old house full of quirks, but I wasn't so sure. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but distinct, creaking across the floor above us. My heart raced as I shook Mark awake. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the bed and went upstairs to check, but he found nothing. The windows were locked, the doors were secure, and there was no sign of anyone. After that, the footsteps became more frequent. Sometimes they were soft, like a child running across the floor, and other times they were heavy, deliberate. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself they were just the house settling, but deep down I knew better. Then there were the whispers. They started as a faint hum, almost inaudible, but over time they grew louder. I would hear them when I was alone in the house, a low murmuring sound that seemed to come from the walls. It wasn't words exactly, more like the echo of a conversation I couldn't quite make out. One day while cleaning the attic, I found a box of old photographs. They were black and white, faded with age, and showed a family posing in front of the house. A man, a woman, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. The woman's face struck me. There was something haunting about her expression, like she was holding back tears. The back of one photograph was labeled in neat handwriting, "The Crawfords, 1923." Curious, I began researching the history of the house. What I found was chilling. The Crawfords had lived there nearly a century ago, but their story didn't have a happy ending. The mother, Eleanor, had been found dead in the house, hanging from the oak tree in the front yard. Her death was ruled a suicide, but rumors swirled about abuse, betrayal, and grief that had consumed her. Not long after, the family moved away, and the house changed hands several times, gaining a reputation as unlucky. The more I learned, the more the whispers seemed to make sense. Eleanor wasn't just a ghost story. She was here in the house, and she wasn't alone. One night, I was in the living room reading when I heard it, a soft sobbing sound coming from the hallway. I froze, my pulse quickening. Slowly, I got up and followed the sound, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. It led me to the dining room, where the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the corner, her back to me. Her figure was faint, like a shadow, but I could make out the long dress she wore, the way her hair hung loose over her shoulders. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her face, pale, hollow, and filled with an unbearable sadness. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. When I told Mark, he looked at me like I was crazy. He tried to reassure me, saying I was stressed, maybe even hallucinating. But I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't ignore it. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in old houses. When I told her about the Crawfords and Eleanor's death, she wasn't surprised. "This house has a history," she said. "You're not the first to experience strange things." She told me about previous owners who had reported similar occurrences, footsteps, whispers, and even apparitions. One family had left after just 3 months, claiming the house was cursed. Another had tried to cleanse it with a priest, but the activity only got worse. I asked her what I should do. She hesitated, then said, "Sometimes they just want to be acknowledged, to tell their story." That night, I sat in the dining room where I had seen Eleanor. I lit a candle and spoke aloud, feeling foolish but determined. "Eleanor," I said, my voice trembling. "I know what happened to you. I'm sorry for your pain. If there's anything I can do to help you, please tell me." The candle flickered, and for a moment, I thought I heard a faint sigh. Then the room grew still. For a few days, the house was quiet. The whispers stopped, and the air felt lighter, almost peaceful. I thought it was over. until the dreams started. They weren't my dreams, not really. They felt like memories, fragments of Eleanor's life. I saw her standing at the kitchen sink, staring out the window as the children played in the yard. I felt her despair as she argued with her husband, his voice cold and cutting. I heard her sobs as she sat alone in the attic, clutching a locket. And then I saw the oak tree. In the dream, it loomed over me, its branches bare against a gray sky. I felt Eleanor's fear, her hopelessness, as she tied the rope and stepped onto the stool. I tried to scream, to stop her, but I was powerless. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, and whispered, "I didn't want to leave them." When I woke, I was crying. I knew what she wanted, to be remembered, to have her story told. I wrote it all down, every detail, and submitted it to a local paper. They published it as a feature, a haunting account of a mother's grief and the legacy of a house that refused to forget. After that, the house changed. The footsteps stopped, the whispers faded, and the air felt warm again. It was as if Eleanor had found peace, her story finally heard. Mark and I stayed in the house for several more years, and though I never saw her again, I often felt her presence, a quiet, comforting watchfulness. When we moved, I left a copy of the article in the attic, along with a note. "Eleanor, you're not alone. You're remembered." Sometimes, late at night, I think about that house on Willow Lane and the woman who still lingers there. I hope she's found the peace she was searching for. And I hope that, in some small way, I helped her find it. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I didn't grow up believing in ghosts. My family was practical, grounded in science and reason. But when I moved into that apartment on Birch Street, I learned that some things defy explanation. It was a modest place, nothing fancy. One bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with windows that overlooked a cracked, overgrown courtyard. I had just finished grad school and needed somewhere cheap and close to work. The ad had seemed perfect, low rent, utilities included, and a quiet neighborhood. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Green, had been eager to hand me the keys. "Not much to it," he said, his voice raspy, "but it's solid. Been here a long time." The first few weeks were uneventful. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and settled into a routine. The neighbors kept to themselves, and the building was quiet, almost too quiet. At night, the silence felt oppressive, like the walls were absorbing all sound. The first strange thing happened on a Thursday night. I had stayed late at work and came home exhausted. As I unlocked the door, I noticed something odd. The hallway light inside my apartment was on. I distinctly remembered turning it off that morning. I stood frozen for a moment, my hand gripping the doorknob. Then, convincing myself I must have forgotten, I stepped inside. The light switch clicked off easily, but my unease lingered. I checked the apartment. Nothing was out of place. No signs of forced entry. Still, I locked the door behind me and double-checked the windows before going to bed. The next night, it happened again. This time, it was the bathroom light. I hadn't used the bathroom before leaving that morning, so I knew I hadn't left it on. My pulse quickened as I walked through the apartment, searching for anything out of the ordinary. There was nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination or faulty wiring, but deep down I felt a growing dread. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, moving slowly across the living room. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to believe it was the building settling, the creak of old wood expanding in the cool night air. But the footsteps weren't random. They had a rhythm, a purpose. Someone, or something, had been walking in my apartment. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I called Mr. Green to ask about the building's history. He chuckled, his voice crackling through the phone. "Old buildings make noise," he said. "It's nothing to worry about." I pressed him further, asking if anyone had lived there before me. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "Lots of people have come and gone over the years. It's an old place." That answer didn't satisfy me. I started asking neighbors about the apartment, but no one seemed to know much. Most had lived there for only a few years, and the ones who had been there longer were tight-lipped. The disturbances continued. Doors I was certain I had closed would be open. Small items like my keys or a coffee mug would move to places I hadn't left them. And then there were the shadows. At night, I would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, a flicker of darkness that vanished the moment I turned my head. One night, while watching TV, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the hallway. It was slow and deliberate, like someone knocking softly on a door. I muted the TV and held my breath, listening. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. I stood and walked toward the hallway, my legs trembling. The sound stopped abruptly as I reached the doorway. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thick, almost suffocating. That's when I saw it, a faint outline on the wall, like a handprint, but elongated and smudged, as if someone had dragged their fingers down the plaster. Terrified, I called my friend Lisa and begged her to stay the night. She arrived within the hour, armed with a sleeping bag and a bottle of wine. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't want her to think I was losing my mind. But I mentioned the noises and the lights. Lisa was skeptical but supportive. "It's probably just an old wiring issue or a draft," she said. "Nothing a good electrician can't fix." That night, we stayed up late, talking and laughing, the way we always did. For a while, I forgot about the strange occurrences, but around 2 a.m., the laughter stopped. We both heard it at the same time, a faint whispering sound coming from the living room. It was soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. Lisa's face went pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat dry. We sat frozen, listening as the whispering grew louder, more urgent. It sounded like multiple voices overlapping, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to ripple and shift. Lisa grabbed my arm. "We need to leave." We bolted from the apartment and spent the rest of the night at her place. The next morning, I called Mr. Green and demanded answers. His cheerful tone from before was gone, replaced by a defensive edge. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "No one else has ever complained." I hung up, frustrated and scared. That evening, I decided to search the apartment for anything that might explain what was happening. I scoured every inch, checking behind furniture, inside closets, even under the floorboards. It was in the bedroom closet that I found it. A small, leather-bound journal tucked into a crack in the wall. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the handwriting shaky. It belonged to a woman named Margaret, who had lived in the apartment decades ago. The entries were disturbing. Margaret wrote about feeling watched, hearing voices, and seeing shadows that moved on their own. Her final entry was the most chilling. "I can't stay here anymore. He's always watching, always waiting. I don't know what he wants, but I can't take it. If you're reading this, leave while you still can." That night, I packed a bag and checked into a motel. I couldn't stay in that apartment another minute. Over the next few days, I made arrangements to break my lease, willing to forfeit my deposit just to get out. As I packed my belongings, I felt the house watching me, its presence heavier than ever. On my last night there, I left Margaret's journal on the kitchen counter, along with a note. "Whoever finds this, be careful." I moved out the next morning, leaving behind the apartment and its secrets. I never spoke to Mr. Green again, and I've avoided driving down Birch Street ever since. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened in that apartment, but sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I feel the same chill I felt that first night, and I wonder if whatever haunted that place followed me.
Story number 5.
It was the summer of 2011 when I first moved into the old house on Maple Street. The house wasn't grand, but had a certain charm about it. It was a 3-story brick home with a steep roof and a large, overgrown garden in the back. The kind of house you'd expect to see in an old movie, where the character always ends up uncovering some long-forgotten secret. My family was excited to settle in, and for the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. The neighborhood was quiet, the neighbors were friendly, and it was just far enough from the hustle and bustle of city life to give us some peace and privacy. I was 16 at the time, and the house was everything I had dreamed of. It had a big attic, and there were long hallways that led to rooms I barely explored at first. We made plans to renovate the house and settle in for the long haul. My room was on the second floor, in the back corner, with a large window that overlooked the garden. It was a lovely spot, or so I thought. The first strange thing happened after I'd been living there for about a month. I woke up one night, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could hear faint creaking noises coming from the hallway. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling, or perhaps just my imagination. But then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps. They came closer to my door, and I held my breath, hoping it was just my mother or father checking in on me. But the steps didn't stop at my door. They kept going as though someone was walking through the hallway. I lay there, frozen, listening intently. The footsteps moved past my door and continued down the stairs, but I didn't hear the sound of the front door opening. It wasn't the sound of someone leaving, just walking. After what felt like an eternity, the noise finally stopped. I stayed in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. Eventually, I managed to fall back asleep, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next morning, I asked my parents if they had gotten up in the night, but they both insisted they hadn't. My dad, who was always the rational one, chalked it up to the house making noises. Old houses do that, he said, shrugging it off. I wanted to believe him, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Over the next few days, I started hearing the footsteps again, always at night, always walking through the hallway. I tried to convince myself that it was just the house settling, that it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. A week later, I decided to explore the house a little more. I had been too distracted by the renovations and the excitement of moving in to really look around, but I figured it was time to get a feel for the place. I started with the attic, as it was the only room I hadn't really investigated yet. It was dusty, filled with old furniture, and the air felt heavy. I went through old boxes, wondering if anything had been left behind by the previous owners. That's when I found it. In the back corner of the attic, behind some old trunks and furniture, there was a small wooden chest. It looked old, really old, and it was covered in dust, as though it hadn't been opened in decades. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to open it. Inside, there were a few old clothes, some faded photographs, and a thick, leather-bound journal. The journal was worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. I opened it and began reading, though the handwriting was difficult to decipher. It was written by a woman named Margaret, and the first few pages described ordinary life, what she ate for dinner, the weather, the people she met. But as I turned the pages, the entries became darker. The journal began to speak of strange noises in the house, of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, of objects being moved in the night. Margaret wrote about a feeling of being watched, a sensation she couldn't shake no matter where she went in the house. As I read on, I felt a chill creep up my spine. Margaret's final entry was haunting. I don't know how much longer I can take it. I hear him every night, walking through the house. I feel his eyes on me, always. I don't know who he is, but I know he's not human. I hope someone will find this and understand. Please, don't stay here. I felt my stomach twist as I closed the journal. The air in the attic felt colder now, and the silence seemed louder. I put everything back in the chest and hurried out of the attic, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself that the journal was just the ramblings of an old, lonely woman, but the words echoed in my mind. Who was Margaret, and who was the he she spoke of? That night, the footsteps returned. But this time, they were different. They were faster, as though the person walking was in a hurry. The sound seemed to move closer to my door, and I could hear a faint scraping noise like fingernails dragging across the floor. I could feel my heart racing as I lay in bed, the room feeling colder than usual. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I held my breath, hoping it was just a figment of my imagination. But then, something strange happened. I heard a voice, soft and whispering, just outside my door. It was a woman's voice, faint but clear. "Help me!" I sat up in bed, wide-eyed, unable to move. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place. The voice continued, growing fainter and fainter until it was gone. The next morning, I told my parents everything. They were concerned, but didn't seem as frightened as I felt. My mother suggested I try to sleep with the light on, or even sleep in a different room for a while. But I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever it wasn't going away. Things only got worse after that. The footsteps became a nightly occurrence, and the whispering voice would sometimes call out my name, sometimes just a quiet, mournful, "Help me." I couldn't take it anymore. I called the local historian to ask about the house's past. What I learned sent a shiver down my spine. The house had been built in the early 1900s by a man named William Parker. He and his wife, Margaret, had lived there for years. However, Margaret had been diagnosed with a mental illness and was confined to the house for the last years of her life. According to the historian, Margaret had become obsessed with the idea that someone was living in the walls of the house, watching her. She had written extensively about it in her journal, and eventually she died under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was a tragic accident. Others whispered that she had taken her own life. Either way, Margaret had been left behind in that house, and her restless spirit still lingered. I had heard enough. I couldn't stay there any longer. I begged my parents to leave, and after much convincing, they agreed. We packed up and left, abandoning the house on Maple Street. I never did find out what happened to Margaret's spirit, but sometimes when I think about that house, I feel the coldness of the air and the weight of the footsteps echoing in the hallways. I wonder if the house is still haunted, waiting for someone else to move in and discover its dark secrets. Story the end.
Story number 6.
When I moved into my first apartment after college, I was excited. It was a small one-bedroom unit in a quiet building on the edge of town. The rent was affordable and the location seemed perfect, close enough to the downtown area for work but far enough to avoid the noise and hustle. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Howard, was friendly but seemed a little off. There was something about the way she looked at me when she handed over the keys that I couldn't quite place, but I brushed it off. She told me the building had been around for decades, that it had been well maintained, and I should feel at home. I didn't think much of it. The first few weeks were fine. I settled in, unpacked my things, and got to know the other tenants in the building. Most of them were older, retired folks who lived relatively quiet lives. They all seemed nice, though a little distant. Everything seemed normal, too normal even, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. That was until the noises started. It began innocuously. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment door. At first, I thought it was just someone walking by. The building had thin walls, and the floors creaked with every step. But the footsteps didn't fade away as they should have. They seemed to stop right outside my door. I sat up, straining to hear. I didn't hear any voices, no one knocking, just the sound of slow, deliberate steps. I convinced myself it was just the building settling or one of the tenants coming home late. Still, the thought made me uneasy. I tried to shake it off, but the next night it happened again. This time I listened more closely. The footsteps sounded like someone dragging their feet, as if they were tired or maybe even shuffling. It wasn't normal. The following days passed without incident, but the noise returned a few nights later. I began to wonder if it was something to do with the building's age. Maybe there were rodents or some kind of animal moving around in the walls. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows in my apartment seemed a little darker, the silence a little more suffocating. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to my apartment, exhausted. I had barely taken off my shoes when I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were louder, closer. I was almost certain they were right outside my door. I stood still, heart pounding in my chest, listening to the sound of dragging feet. They weren't just footsteps anymore. They sounded like they were moving in a slow, purposeful way, like someone was pacing back and forth. My pulse raced and my mind raced with possibilities. I considered opening the door to see who it was, but the thought of finding nothing there scared me more than facing whoever it might be. The noise stopped as abruptly as it had started, but I was shaken. I quickly locked the door and turned on every light in the apartment, even though I knew it wouldn't help. I tried calling Mrs. Baskin, Howard, to ask if there had been any issues in the building, but she didn't answer. I felt foolish for even thinking about it. There was no way anyone would believe me. But as the days wore on, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. The footsteps weren't the only thing. One afternoon, I came home from work and noticed that the chair in my kitchen had been moved. It wasn't a huge shift, just a few inches, but I was certain it hadn't been like that when I left. I chalked it up to forgetfulness or maybe just being too tired, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The real turning point came a week later when I woke up in the middle of the night to a soft whispering sound. At first, I thought it was just the hum of my refrigerator or maybe the neighbors talking through the thin walls, but then I realized that the voice sounded too clear, too close. It was coming from the living room, from behind the door. Help me. The whisper was so faint that I almost thought I imagined it, but it was unmistakable. I lay in bed, paralyzed, too scared to move. The whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. Please, help me. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced and my heart pounded in my chest. I was afraid to get up, afraid to see what might be in the living room. The voice was soft and trembling, almost like it was coming from someone who had been crying. I wanted to ignore it, tell myself it was just my imagination, but the desperation in the voice felt too real. Eventually, I gathered the courage to get up. My legs were shaky as I crossed the room and opened the door to the living room. The apartment was empty. There was no one there. No one, except for me. The next morning, I went to Mrs. Howard's apartment to ask her about the history of the building. I needed answers. She greeted me at the door with a tight smile and invited me in. Her apartment was much older than mine, filled with heavy furniture and dusty old bookshelves. I noticed that she had an air of melancholy about her, like she was a person who had seen too much in her life. "What's on your mind, dear?" she asked, her voice soft. I hesitated for a moment before asking her if anything strange had ever happened in the building. She paused, her eyes clouding over for a moment. "Strange, you say? Well, the building's been here for a long time, older than I am. People come and go, but some things never change." "What do you mean?" I pressed. She didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in thought for a moment before speaking again, her voice quieter this time. "You should be careful. Some of the tenants don't like it when new people move in. Some of them don't leave." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean? Who hasn't left?" Mrs. Howard didn't answer. Instead, she stood up and moved to a cupboard, taking out a small old-fashioned key. "I think it's time you see for yourself," she said, her voice almost a whisper. She led me down the hallway to a door at the very end of the building. The door was old and weathered, with a lock that seemed too heavy for the frame. She unlocked it with the key and pushed it open, revealing a small, dark room. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Dusty shelves lined the walls, and the air smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in decades. "This room belonged to the previous tenant," Mrs. Howard said quietly. "A man named Charles. He was a bit odd. No one ever really knew much about him. He kept to himself. But after he passed away, the strange occurrences started. The noises, the voices, they never really went away." I stepped into the room, my breath catching in my throat. There was a coldness here that I couldn't explain, and it wasn't just the temperature. It was a heavy, oppressive feeling, like something was pressing down on me. Mrs. Howard looked at me, her expression grave. "You're not the first person to hear them," she said softly. "People come and go, but some things don't. Charles never really left." I stood there stunned, not sure what to make of it. But then I heard it again, the faint, dragging footsteps. They were in the hallway outside the door. Slowly, deliberately, like someone pacing back and forth. I turned to Mrs. Black Howard. "What should I do?" She simply nodded. "Sometimes it's best to leave things alone, but sometimes, they don't let you." That night, I packed my things and left. I never told anyone about the footsteps or the whispering voices. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the building was old and had its quirks. But as I closed the door to my apartment for the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I moved to the small town of New Haven in 2014 after landing a job at a local bookstore. The town was quaint, with cobblestone streets and buildings that seemed to have been frozen in time, still bearing the marks of history. The people were kind, the air was fresh, and it felt like a place where I could finally unwind. I had been living in the city before, and everything there was always so fast-paced, so noisy. I was looking forward to this slower pace of life, and I felt lucky to have found a job that would allow me to focus on the things I loved: reading, quiet evenings, and a sense of peace. I found a small apartment on the edge of town, just a few blocks from the bookstore. It was in an old building that had been converted into 4 apartments. The landlord, a quiet man named Mr. Harris, told me that the building was well over 100 years old. He said it had once been a small inn for travelers, though it had long since been abandoned as such. The apartment I rented was on the second floor, with tall windows that overlooked the street below. When I first moved in, everything seemed perfect. The floors creaked when I walked across them, and the radiator would groan occasionally, but it was charming in a way. The apartment had an old-world feel to it that I liked. The bedroom was cozy, and the kitchen was just big enough for me to cook a nice meal if I wanted to. It had an atmosphere that felt like home almost immediately. It wasn't until the third night that I started to feel like something was off. I had just finished reading in bed and turned off the lamp beside my nightstand. The apartment was completely quiet, and I was drifting off to sleep when I heard a sound that made my heart skip a beat. It was a faint tapping, almost like fingernails gently brushing against the walls. I froze, unsure of whether I was imagining it or not. The sound was coming from the direction of the hallway outside my bedroom door. It was so soft that I could barely hear it, but it was unmistakable. At first, I thought it might have been the house settling, or maybe the wind rattling the old windows. I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep, but the tapping continued. It wasn't constant, but it was persistent. I lay there, wide awake, straining to hear it again. It would come in intervals, like someone was pacing in the hallway, tapping on the walls with their fingers. I tried to ignore it, but sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, I asked Mr. Harris if he had noticed anything strange in the building. He gave me a puzzled look and assured me that it was an old building, so sounds like that were not unusual. The walls have a way of amplifying noises, he said. It's nothing to worry about. But the tapping didn't stop. It continued every night, right around the same time, just as I was starting to drift into sleep. The tapping wasn't loud, but it was persistent enough to make me uncomfortable. Eventually, I decided to investigate. I waited until I heard it again, and then I got out of bed, quietly opening my door and peering out into the dark hallway. The hallway was empty, just like it always was, and there was no one in sight. But the tapping, it was still there, faint but clear. I stepped out of my room and followed the sound. I walked to the end of the hallway, where the stairs led down to the first floor. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear, but the noise had stopped. I felt foolish. Maybe it had been my imagination. I turned to head back to my apartment, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the far end of the hallway, there was an old, worn door. I had never paid much attention to it before. It looked like one of the doors that led to the attic or some other forgotten part of the building. But now, as I stood there, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of light came from behind it, and I could just make out the faintest of shadows moving inside. I stood frozen, heart pounding in my chest. The door had always been locked, or so I thought. No one had ever mentioned a door to the attic or any other room that might be there. The idea that someone could be in there made my skin crawl. But what terrified me the most was the feeling I got as I stood there, like someone was watching me. The light behind the door flickered, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving across the floor, but there was no one in sight. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly backed away, returning to my apartment, my heart still racing. That night, the tapping was louder than usual. It wasn't just a soft tap. It sounded more like the thudding of something heavy against the walls. I could hear it clearly, echoing down the hallway. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to call Mr. Harris the next day and ask him about the door, the sounds, and anything else I could think of. When I explained the situation, his face went pale. He seemed to hesitate before speaking. "That door, you shouldn't go near it," he said, his voice shaking. "It's been there for a long time, but no one goes up there. It's not safe." "Why?" I asked, confused and increasingly unsettled. Mr. Harris took a deep breath, looking as though he was about to tell me something that had been buried for years. There were some things that happened in this building long ago. People talked about strange occurrences, voices in the walls, things that couldn't be explained. I don't know all the details, Karij, but there was a woman who lived here many years ago. She was troubled. People said she heard things too. She heard tapping, knocking, sounds coming from inside the walls. Some people even claim to have seen her talking to someone in the hallway late at night, but no one ever saw anyone else. It drove her mad. She died here. No one really talks about it anymore, but it's best if you just stay away from that room. I felt my stomach churn. It was clear that Mr. Harris didn't want to go into detail, but I could tell that something dark had happened in that building. And the tapping? The whispers? Maybe it wasn't just the house settling after all. The next night, the tapping was worse than ever. It was louder, more frantic, almost like someone was desperately trying to get my attention. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and crept out into the hallway again, determined to find out what was going on. This time, the door to the old room was wide open. There was no sliver of light, no shadow moving behind it. It was completely dark, and the air felt cold and thick. I stood there for a long time, my body frozen in place. I could hear the faint tapping coming from within, but it wasn't just on the walls. It sounded like it was coming from inside the room itself, like someone was knocking on the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Finally, with my heart in my throat, I stepped forward and crossed the threshold of the door. The room was empty. There was nothing in there but dust and debris. But something was off. The air was heavy, and I could see the faint outline of something against the far wall. My flashlight flickered, and when the light steadied, I saw a message written on the wall in what appeared to be old, faded writing. "Help me." I gasped and stepped back, my heart pounding as my mind raced. I knew then that I wasn't dealing with a strange noise. I wasn't imagining things. There was something or someone still in that building, and it had been there a lot longer than I had. I ran back to my apartment that night and packed my things, my hands shaking as I stuffed my clothes into a bag. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't live in that building any longer. As I left, I heard the tapping one last time, faint but unmistakable, as though someone was still trying to reach out to me. I don't know who or what was in that room. I don't know what happened to the woman Mr. Harris mentioned. All I know is that I never went back, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the sound of the tapping, and the message on the wall that seemed to beg for help.
Story number 8.
When I first moved to the small, sleepy town of Candler's Grove, I was hoping for peace. I'd spent years in the city, dealing with the stress and constant noise, and I thought a quiet, rural town would be the perfect place to recharge. The house I found was a quaint two-story cottage on the outskirts, with an old stone path leading to the front door and overgrown ivy creeping up the walls. It had been on the market for a while, and the price was surprisingly low, which I thought was a stroke of luck. The locals were friendly, though they were quiet and kept to themselves. I quickly made a routine. I'd go into town during the day for work and supplies, and in the evenings I'd relax in my cozy new home. The house had its quirks, creaky floors, a leaky faucet, and the occasional draft, but I loved it. It felt like a place where I could finally settle and relax. However, after a few weeks, things started to feel off. It began with small, unexplainable things. I'd come home from work and find the furniture slightly shifted, the cushions on the couch rearranged in a way I didn't remember. The first time it happened, I thought I was just being forgetful. Maybe I'd moved something without thinking about it. But it continued. One evening, I returned home to find my favorite chair by the window, facing the opposite direction. I was certain I hadn't touched it. I even took a moment to sit down and try to remember if I had shifted it while cleaning or moving things around, but I couldn't come up with an explanation. I chalked it up to the house settling or my mind playing tricks on me. But then, the noises started. At first, it was just a faint tapping. I'd be in bed, the house dark and quiet, and I'd hear a soft knocking sound coming from somewhere downstairs. It was so subtle that I could easily ignore it, but after a few nights, it started to get louder. The knocks would come in patterns, 3 taps, then silence, then 2 more. It didn't sound like it was coming from the walls, but from somewhere in the living room or the kitchen. I told myself it was the house settling, or maybe even an animal in the walls. But when it continued, night after night, I started to feel uneasy. I mentioned it to a neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins, who had lived in Candler's Grove her entire life. "Old houses do that," she said with a smile, her eyes twinkling. They creak and groan, and sometimes you get a little tapping here and there. Don't worry about it. I smiled back, trying to believe her, but something about the way she said it made me feel like she knew more than she was letting on. As the days passed, the tapping grew louder and more frequent. It wasn't random anymore. It was like someone was trying to get my attention. I couldn't sleep, constantly lying awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to start again. And when it did, I finally decided to investigate. One night, I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, moving quietly through the dark house. The air was cold, and the floorboards creaked under my feet. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood still for a moment, listening. The house was completely silent. But then, as I stood there, I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it was louder and more distinct, as if someone was knocking on the front door. I walked toward the door and stood there for a moment, heart pounding in my chest. I expected to see someone on the other side, maybe a neighbor or a trick-or-treater from earlier that evening, but when I opened the door, no one was there. I stood there, staring out into the dark yard. Nothing seemed out of place. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves. I shook my head, telling myself I was just overthinking things. But then I heard it again, this time coming from the hallway behind me. I turned around quickly, my heart racing. The tapping was coming from the living room. Slowly, I moved toward the source of the noise. I felt a chill in the air, a coldness that seemed to seep through the walls. When I entered the living room, the tapping stopped, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. But then, I saw it. The old rocking chair by the window, the one I'd never touched, was rocking back and forth, slowly, methodically. No one was sitting in it. The floor beneath it creaked with each rock. I froze, staring at it, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced to come up with an explanation. Maybe the wind was blowing through a crack in the window. Maybe the old wood was just moving on its own. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I moved forward cautiously, reaching out to steady the chair. But before my hand could touch it, it stopped. The rocking ceased, and the room fell into silence. I didn't know what to think anymore. I decided to stay up that night, waiting for the next odd thing to happen. I wasn't sure if I was hoping it would happen, or if I was afraid it wouldn't. The night dragged on, the minutes ticking by. And then, just as I was starting to feel my eyes grow heavy, the tapping started again. It was louder now, coming from the walls behind me, not from the front door or the living room. It was relentless, tapping in a rhythm that I couldn't ignore. I jumped up, heart pounding, and turned toward the wall. I stepped closer, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The tapping grew faster, more frantic, and then, suddenly, it stopped. In the silence that followed, I felt something brush against my arm, cold, like ice. I turned around quickly, my breath catching in my throat, but no one was there. But I could feel it, the presence. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over me. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath. I went outside for a walk, trying to clear my mind. As I walked down the street, I saw Mrs. Wilkins sitting on her porch, watching me. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked, her eyes studying me carefully. "I'm not sure," I replied honestly. "I've been hearing strange noises in the house. Tapping, knocking, and something else. It's hard to explain." Mrs. Wilkins paused for a moment before replying. "That house, it has a history. It was built a long time ago, and people have lived there before. Some people don't stay long. They hear things from the past." I was taken aback by her words. "What do you mean?" She sighed and looked away, as if weighing whether to say more. "Some say it's the spirit of a woman who used to live there. She lost her family years ago, and after that she became obsessed. Some people say she never really left. She's still in that house, waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Waiting for someone to listen, to hear her, to understand. I felt my stomach tighten as I stood there, unsure of what to say. Mrs. Wilkins didn't elaborate further, but I knew from the way she spoke that there was more to the story than she was letting on. She stood up slowly and walked inside her house without another word. That evening, I returned to the house, my mind racing. I was no longer sure of what I believed, but I couldn't shake the idea that something or someone was trying to communicate with me. I had to know the truth. I spent the rest of the evening researching the house's history. I found an old newspaper article from the early 1900s. It was about a woman named Eliza Caldwell, who had lived in the house with her husband and young daughter. The article mentioned a tragic fire that had taken their lives one winter night. Eliza had survived the fire, but her grief had consumed her. Neighbors said she became reclusive, talking about hearing her family's voices, their footsteps in the halls, their laughter. She was found dead in the house years later, still clutching a faded photograph of her daughter. That night the tapping came again, louder than ever. I stayed in the living room, waiting. I heard it. 3 taps, then 2, exactly the same pattern. This time I didn't hesitate. I walked to the source of the sound and stood by the wall. I placed my hand on the wood, my heart thudding in my chest. And then a voice, faint but clear, whispered in my ear, "Please, don't leave me." I pulled my hand away, my blood running cold. The voice was so real, so full of sorrow that it left me breathless. I knew then that I wasn't alone in that house. But what could I do? How could I leave when someone or something needed me? Story the end.
Story number 9.
I moved to the small town of Millfield, hoping for a fresh start. The city life had worn me down with its noise, traffic, and constant pressure. Millfield was the complete opposite. A sleepy town with tree-lined streets and cozy cottages tucked away behind old fences. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and the closest thing to excitement was the annual town fair. My new job at the local library offered a sense of peace and simplicity. It was a beautiful building, an old brick structure with high arched windows, a huge clock tower, and a rich history. The moment I walked in, I felt as though I had stepped into a different time, a quieter world. I immediately loved it. The house I rented was just a short walk from the library, an old Victorian that looked like it belonged in a painting. The landlord, Mrs. Peterson, had been kind enough to show me around and explain the little quirks of the place. "It's old, but it's sturdy," she assured me with a smile. "Hasn't had much work done in years, but it's still standing strong." The house had its share of character: creaky floorboards, a wood-burning fireplace, and a staircase that seemed to groan under my weight. The best part was the attic, which I quickly turned into a cozy reading nook. It was small, but there was something comforting about the low-sloped ceilings and the quiet solitude. At first, everything seemed perfect. I spent my days working at the library and my nights curled up with a book in my little attic retreat. The town was peaceful, and I felt myself slowly letting go of the stresses of city life. It was as though the house and the town had worked their magic, helping me to feel at home for the first time in years. But after a few weeks, I began to notice things that didn't quite add up. Small things, really. Just enough to unsettle me. For example, sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night to hear soft footsteps walking down the hall. At first, I assumed it was just the house settling. Old homes creak, after all, especially in the quiet of the night. But the footsteps were always deliberate, slow, like someone was walking just outside my door. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the house's old wooden floors. But the strange occurrences started to escalate. One evening, after a long day at the library, I returned home to find a book had been placed on the dining table. It was one of my favorite novels, but I hadn't taken it out of the attic. I hadn't even been downstairs that day. I could feel my heart start to race as I picked it up, certain that I hadn't left it there. Then there were the whispers. I couldn't quite make them out, but I would hear soft murmurs in the middle of the night. It felt like someone was speaking in the hallway just outside my door, but when I got up to investigate, no one was there. The whispers were faint and incomprehensible, but they were there, and they came every night, without fail. I had to admit to myself that something strange was happening in the house, but I didn't want to believe it was anything supernatural. It felt easier to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me after years of living in the city, surrounded by noise and chaos. Maybe the house was just creaking from age, or perhaps the wind was causing strange noises outside. The turning point came on a particularly cold evening in late October. The air was thick with the smell of fallen leaves, and a storm was rolling in. I had settled into my reading nook in the attic, the fire crackling softly in the fireplace. I was so absorbed in my book that I almost didn't hear the soft tapping at the door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again. 3 soft taps, almost rhythmic, like someone knocking gently. I got up and walked to the door. There was no one there, but I could feel a chill in the air, colder than it should have been, even with the storm outside. The air felt wrong, somehow. I stepped back into the room, my mind racing. I had never been one to jump to conclusions, but this was getting beyond what I could rationalize. I decided to try and confront it once and for all. I sat down in the middle of the room, trying to clear my mind. I told myself I would sit and wait, just to see if something would happen. At first, nothing did. The wind howled outside, and the house creaked and groaned as it always did. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone was standing in the room with me, just out of sight. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure. A shadowy shape, barely visible against the dark wood paneling. It was a woman, or at least it looked like a woman. She was tall, with long dark hair that cascaded around her face like a veil. She wore an old-fashioned dress that looked out of place in the modern world, its lace and fabric delicate, almost as if it belonged to another time. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure didn't move toward me, but I could feel her presence, overwhelming and cold. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring right at me. The whispers grew louder now, swirling around me like an invisible force. I tried to speak, but no words came out. It was as though the room itself was closing in on me, the walls pressing in with the weight of an unspoken truth. I don't know how long I sat there, locked in place by fear. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. The figure didn't seem threatening. It was more sad, as if she was waiting for something, or someone. Eventually, the figure began to fade. Slowly, she dissolved into the shadows of the room, her form dissipating like smoke. The whispers stopped, and the chill in the air lifted, though the weight of the moment remained, pressing heavily on my chest. I sat there for a long time, unsure of what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Had it been a dream? But the feeling lingered, like something had changed in that room, something that I could never quite explain. The next day, I went to the library and did some research on the house. I found that it had been built in the early 1900s, and that a woman named Clara Richmond had lived there for many years. Clara was the daughter of the house's original owners, and she had died young under mysterious circumstances. The records weren't clear, but some of the townspeople believed she had suffered from some kind of mental illness and that she had died alone in the house. The more I read, the more I realized that Clara's presence might be the source of the strange happenings. She had lived in the house, and perhaps she never left. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if she was trying to communicate with me, or if she was simply trapped in a place that she had once called home. After that night, the noises in the house grew more intense. The tapping, the whispers, the cold air, it all returned with a vengeance. But this time, I didn't feel as afraid. I had made peace with the fact that the house, and perhaps Clara herself, was trying to make contact. She wasn't a threat. She was just lost, like I had been before moving to Millfield. I spent the next few weeks trying to learn more about Clara. I visited the local cemetery and found her grave, marked by a simple stone with her name and a small inscription, "Beloved Daughter." I sat there for hours, feeling a strange connection to her, as if she had been waiting for someone to acknowledge her existence. I told her I was listening, that I understood her sadness, and slowly the whispers began to fade. It's been months now, and the house is quieter. The tapping has stopped, and the whispers are no more. The chill in the air has lifted, and the house feels peaceful again. I still feel Clara's presence sometimes, but it's no longer unsettling. I think she's found some sort of peace, and maybe so have I. And now, when the wind blows through the trees outside, I can't help but think of her, of the woman who once lived in this house and who, for some reason, chose to make contact with me. Perhaps she had been waiting for someone who would listen, and in the end, maybe I was the one who needed her presence more than I ever realized. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I had never been a believer in ghosts. Growing up, I was always the skeptic. I would scoff at stories of haunted houses and cursed places. convinced that they were all the result of overactive imaginations or the tendency of people to exaggerate. That all changed the night I stayed in my uncle's cabin in the woods. It was a simple cabin, nestled deep in the forest about 2 hours away from the nearest town. My uncle Paul had built it himself, using materials from the land around him. He often joked that it was his getaway from the world, a place where he could escape the chaos of life and reconnect with nature. I had visited him a few times before, but it had always been during the day. This time, I was planning to stay for the weekend and experience it all, day and night. As I drove up the narrow, winding road to the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. It was beautiful in its own way, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. I told myself it was just the isolation of the place, the fact that it was getting dark so quickly. I had always felt more comfortable in the hustle and bustle of the city, and the quiet of the woods was something that still made me nervous. When I arrived at the cabin, Uncle Paul was waiting on the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips and a mug of coffee in his hand. He greeted me with a hearty laugh and a big hug, immediately making me feel more at ease. We spent the evening talking, catching up on the latest news, and enjoying a quiet meal together. The cabin was cozy, with a wood-burning stove in the corner and mismatched furniture that gave it a lived-in rustic feel. The windows were large, offering a breathtaking view of the forest, and the air smelled like pine and earth. That night, after a few beers and more stories, Uncle Paul excused himself to bed, leaving me alone in the cabin. I settled into the armchair by the fire, a good book in hand, and tried to relax. But something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air in the cabin felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The fire crackled and popped, casting shadows on the walls, but the room felt oddly silent, as if the outside world had ceased to exist. I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on the book in my lap, but then I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. A tapping. It was coming from somewhere inside the cabin, and it seemed to echo in the quiet of the room. I looked around, my eyes darting from one corner to the next. There was no one else here. Uncle Paul was asleep in his room. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps the wind outside. But the tapping persisted. I got up from the chair and walked to the window, peering out into the dark woods. The forest was alive with the sounds of night. Crickets chirping, the rustling of leaves. But there was no sign of anything that could have caused the noise. I returned to the chair, trying to push the unease from my mind. But just as I was about to sit back down, the tapping came again, louder this time. It was coming from the wall behind me. I froze. The room seemed to grow colder, and I could feel a shiver run down my spine. I slowly turned my head toward the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I stood up and walked over to the wall, pressing my ear against the cold wood. The tapping stopped. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe an animal had gotten inside the walls, a squirrel, perhaps, or a bird. But as I stood there in the silence, I knew deep down that wasn't it. The noise hadn't felt like that. It was too purposeful, too human. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was nothing. But then I heard it again. This time, it was a voice. It was faint, just a whisper, but it was clear enough for me to understand. Help me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice wasn't my uncle's. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. It was a woman's voice, weak and pleading, as though she was trapped somewhere, unable to escape. I turned slowly, my mind racing for an explanation. My first instinct was to call out to Uncle Paul, but something stopped me. The air in the cabin had grown unnaturally still, and I felt a strange pressure in my chest, as if something was watching me. I slowly made my way to the hallway, trying to steady my breathing. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the fire in the living room. The tapping had stopped, but the voice echoed in my ears, growing louder with each step I took. Help me. I reached the door to Uncle Paul's room and gently knocked. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I opened the door cautiously, peering inside. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the blankets undisturbed, but the air was thick with a sense of abandonment, as if someone had been there but had suddenly disappeared. I turned around, my heart racing, and glanced back down the hallway. There, at the end of the corridor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure. It was faint, like a shadow in the dark, but I could make out the outline of a woman standing in the doorway of the room at the far end of the hall. She was tall, with long hair that seemed to float around her face, and she wore a dress that looked old, almost antique. Her eyes were wide and empty, staring at me with a hollow intensity. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my feet glued to the floor. The woman didn't speak, but I could feel her presence, heavy and suffocating. It was as if she was waiting for me to do something, but I didn't know what. All I could do was stare at her, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The air grew colder, and I could feel the temperature drop, as though the cabin itself was reacting to her presence. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and took a tentative step forward. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. She just stood there, watching me. And then, as if she had grown tired of waiting, she faded into the darkness. One moment, she was there, and the next, she was gone. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something had been in the house, something I couldn't explain. I ran back to the living room, my eyes darting around the room, expecting to see the figure standing there. But there was nothing. I was shaking now, my heart thundering in my chest. I didn't want to stay in that cabin any longer. I wanted to leave, but the road back to the town was long, and I didn't want to drive through the forest in the dark. I tried to call Uncle Paul's phones, but it went straight to voicemail. It seemed like everything was working against me. The tapping started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the window. I rushed over, my hands trembling, and pulled the curtain aside. There was nothing outside, just the inky blackness of the forest. No one was there. But the tapping continued, growing louder with each passing second, as though it were coming from inside the room. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and bolted out the front door, not caring about the cold. I ran into the woods, not knowing where I was going, just wanting to get as far away from the cabin as possible. I heard the tapping again, but this time it was distant, fading as I ran deeper into the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the road, breathless and shaking. I spent the night in my car, too afraid to return to the cabin. In the morning, when I finally mustered the courage to go back, Uncle Paul was there, waiting for me. He looked confused when I explained what had happened, but he didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "The cabin's got a history. People say it's haunted by a woman who died here a long time ago. Her name was Elizabeth. She was lost in the woods, and no one ever found her. They say she still roams these woods, looking for someone to help her." I don't know what happened that night, but I never went back to that cabin. I don't know if it was a ghost, or if I just lost my mind from being so isolated, but I can still hear the tapping sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when I'm alone. And every time I do, I wonder if she's still out there, waiting.